Sorry for this, it takes a little bit of time. All right, should we get going? Hi, welcome. You should know me by now. So this is the second lecture, which I would probably say this is the first real lecture. Previous was just introduction. I updated the first slides today. So the slides that are on the Canvas page is currently the one that I gave on Monday. All right. So today's lecture is about Ethernet, switching, VLANs, link aggregation, and a little bit about security. All of these things, the thing that brings these guys together is that they are all considered to be on layer 2. I'm a very basic, fundamental guy, so I like to start things at the bottom. As I understand, many of you guys have electrical engineering backgrounds, so then starting at the lower layers kind of makes sense. We're not talking about signaling, how the electrical signals or optical signals are transmitted, but this is on layer 2. If you have questions, wave your hand, raise your hand, or type in the chat those that are online. All right? So the outline for today is Ethernet, switching, link aggregation, and VLAN. Those are the 4 things we're going to be talking about. So let's get going. Ethernet, or IEEE 802.3. It was drafted on a napkin sometime in the 70s. Not really sure when. It is a multi-access protocol. The initial draft of Ethernet was based on the Aloha protocol that was designed, implemented by Abramson at University of Hawaii. At the University of Hawaii, they had an interesting challenge in the sense that they wanted to communicate with multiple stations, but these stations were at different islands. And they didn't really have the opportunity to pull wires to everybody. So the way that they did that is that they created or used the thing that's called carrier sense multiple access, CSMA. This has also the add-on CD, collision detection. It's a very simple protocol. It basically works, you're listening for a carrier. If there is a carrier, then you can talk. Now, if the sending station starts to transmit, due to signal propagation times, we might have cases where, when I'm starting to talk, some of you guys can start to talk. If we happen to start talking at the same time, there is a point when our signals will crash, right? They will collide, and we cannot really hear it out. Now, our ears are good at handling that, but a computer or this type of device is not. It will become gibberish. There's where the CD comes into collision detection comes into play. So you start talking, and if there's collision detected by you, you know, okay, my signal got scrambled. I'm stopping transmission. That's the principle of CSMA CD. Now, Ethernet was, by the way, Aloha was a wireless protocol. It was used to transmit radio signals on radios. And anybody who worked on radio, everybody can push the transmit button, right? So instead of having wireless, they put a wire, the ether, so to say. And the benefit of having a wire is that the probability of noise drops drastically. And then to this ether, you put receivers and transmitters. Basically, the ether still works as the medium, a shared medium that everybody that is attached to that medium can talk to at any point in time, but we don't get any additional noise. We can get some noise, but compared to just sending a radio signal, this is much better. So, development of Ethernet was done by Xerox PARC. The guy that initiated it was Robert Metcalfe. And there were a lot of other people. Robert Metcalfe is the guy that is considered to be the Ethernet's founder or father. And this is the principle. At the time that Ethernet was conceived, there were a lot of different competing technologies. We're talking in the 70s, computers were starting up. Computers were not a big deal. It was a big deal, but it was not a massive business as it is today. Networking was rather new. You had a computer that was the size of a room. You walked to the computer, you gave it a job, right? And then after a while, sometimes we need to exchange data between these guys, and then this is how networking started to go. But there were a lot of different competing technologies at that point in time. The placement of Ethernet in the layer cake is on the network level. No, the network interface or the data layer. Actually, I can't remember what it's called in the TCP/IP model, but it's layer 2, data link. On the OSI, it's called data link, but it also includes the physical. Because Ethernet comes with one part that describes the interface upward, but it also contains a part that describes the physical level and the signaling that goes onto the wire. So it covers both link layer, data link, and physical level. And in the TCP/IP, it's just the network interface. The idea, or the principle, now we're taking a little bit sidestep here, the idea of the layers is to simplify implementation and separate concerns. When we on a daily basis, we talk about packets, frames, messages, segments, etc., etc. But those are just names that are applied to a specific layer in the layer cake. The general names are, we generalize this, we have layer n+1 and n. In between them, we have an interface that describes how can layer n interact with layer n+1, or vice versa. How does layer n+1 interact with layer n? This interface have service access points. Nowadays, we perhaps would call that the API, Application Program Interface. But this is how they can communicate, or how they're supposed to be communicated. Well, this is how we would like to model their interaction. At each layer, we have ICI, Interface Control Information, and we have an SDU, Service Data Unit. Together, SDU and ICI becomes a PDU, a Protocol Data Unit. Now, the Protocol Data Unit, this is the nth layer PDU. Now, in Ethernet, that would be considered to be a frame. In IP, that would be considered to be an IP packet. In the IP packet, this is the IP header, and this is the payload. In the Ethernet layer, that's the Ethernet header, and that's the payload of the frame. And you use this to describe the application level and the transport level in any way you want it. I just want to bring, the reason why it's here is that you might encounter these descriptions if you haven't already. How many has seen this? None? Okay. then I think it was a good way of showing it to you. All right. So, coming to the Ethernet layers. It is in the data link layer and physical to some extent. But the Ethernet in the data link layer has two levels of its own. It has the link layer control, logical link layer control, and it has the medium access control. Below it, we would have the medium, the physical level. The nice thing with Ethernet is that this upper level, IEEE 802.2, is a common interface for all of the 802 protocols. As I said before, when Ethernet came about, there were a lot of other competing protocols or networking protocols or layer 2 protocols. At that point in time, we had Ethernet, we had token ring, and we had token bus. And that would be the 8.3 and 4, I think. 8.2.11, which you guys probably know as Wi-Fi, is just another medium access control, but it's below 8.2.2. I might be a little bit off there. I think 802 is the logical link control, and 8.2.2 is the Ethernet specification, whereas 8.2.3 is token ring or token bus, and then 8.2.4 is either token ring or token bus, but the other one, right? But the point being, the interface that is facing upwards is the same. There might be slightly differences if you need to talk to an 8.2.11 device, but the principal parts are the same. That is a good thing, because if you now have something, let's take, if you happen to plug your thing into a token ring, the medium access changes, but you can still use your upper level applications. You can still talk in the same way. Addressing. So, in Ethernet, addresses are 48 bits, or 6 bytes. Compared to IP version 4, that has 32 bytes. 32 bytes would be a lot, right? Now, 32 bits. Whereas in IPv6, we have 128 bits, right? But Ethernet had 48 bits. So it's more than IP, but less than IPv6. There are a couple of different ways of writing that address. So here you see the first, the most common ways of writing it. You have the grouping of byte with a semicolon in between. This is one way of doing it. The other is, instead of using semicolons, you use dashes. The third approach is to use, I think it's word. You group them into groups of 2 bytes. And the last one is to group everything into one. It is the same information, but depicted or visualized in 4 different ways. Depending on your environment, and whatever, you may or may not be able to use either of them. It's how people have implemented it. But the address is the same. But just be aware that they can be written somewhat different. It's the same information, right? The addresses are divided into 2 chunks. A unicast chunk and a multicast chunk. The first bit decides this. If it is a 0, that means it's a multicast address. If it's a 1 or high, if it's a 1, then it means it is a unicast address. Now, to make things even more segmented, the unicast address is divided into two chunks. You have 24 bits that is used for the organizational unique ID, and then 24 bits that are assigned by the organization. Now, why do you think this is important? Of course, it's for communication. How do we pick addresses in IP? If I set up an IP network, I can pick whatever address I want, right? If I set up an Ethernet network, I can pick whatever address I want, right? Technically, I can do that. This is just software. But if everybody does that, that will become complicated. And the probability that someone happened to pick an address that is already assigned is non-zero. Now, so by having these assignments or way of giving out addresses, the IEEE, the standard organization IEEE, have put the job on the manufacturers. So each manufacturer, organizational unique ID, is given an ID. Say, hey, here's your ID. Here you have 24 bits. Do whatever you want with them. And as they manufacture ports, they start with number 1, 2, 3, 4, and keep on going. Once they have expanded all the 24 bits, they go back to IEEE and say, we need another organizational ID. And they get that. So, by doing like this, we should not have any address conflicts on the devices that are handed out or manufactured. Should not happen because they are controlled. Things become a little bit complicated when we go to virtualized scenarios. But remember this, we have 48 bits, total 6 bytes. 47 of those are used for each space. That means we have 47 bits of multicast, and we have 47 bits of unicast. That's a shitload of addresses. Basically 2 to the power of 47 per chunk. So, the medium access control. This is how Ethernet, the medium access control, MAC, in half duplex works. Let's walk through it. You guys online, you have to figure out where I am. Let's start with the transmit. We're starting at the transmit. So we assemble the frame. Basically, we collect the data that comes from the layer on top of us. So the frame is now completed. Now we check, is the channel busy? The carrier sense, remember? Yes. Then we iterate around here until it's not busy. At that point in time, we do something that's called wait in the frame gap. So the wait in the frame gap means that once I hear that nobody's talking on the channel, I wait a certain amount of time, called a frame gap, to make sure that all the communication on this channel has died out. Let's say this is the medium. If I'm listening here, and this guy is talking, I hear it, and once the communication, which is this part, has passed me, I notice silence, right? But the signal can still be transmitted. And I need to wait enough time so that the signal can have gone all the way over here and back to ensure that no one else has started talking. At that point in time, we assume that it is silent and I can start transmitting. Doesn't prevent someone over here from starting transmitting, right? But this is how we do it. We wait this into frame gap, and then we start transmission. Now we are about and while we're transmitting, we're listening. Is there a collision? Basically, do we hear something else than what we're transmitting? Yes. Shit. So we started talking at the same time or similar as someone else. Send a jamming signal. So now make sure that everybody on this medium hears that there's a problem. I realize, okay, whatever I heard is crap. Because that's a mixture of two signals. Then we do something that's called increment attempts. So this is our first attempt at transmission. Now, if you have tried too many times, but looking at how many attempts have we done, at some point in time we give up. But if you have done that, then we just return problems, we cannot transmit. If it's not, then we do something that's called compute a backup. So now, someone else is wanting to transmit. Now, before we try to transmit again, before we go up here, we do a wait. And this is what's called, usually referred to as an exponential backup. If there's someone talking, we calculate the backup time, and then we wait that amount of time before we go back and check is the channel busy. If it's not, okay, then we reinitiate this transmission procedure. Wait the frame gap, start transmission, collision detection. No. Okay, we won't go here. But let's say it was another collision. We go back here, jam, increment. At some point in time, we're going to have tried too many times and we go back. This is not connection-oriented or resilient communication. It will be that. But it lets you know at least, I could not do it. Then it's a matter for the upper layer to react and handle that for the time. In the case we get down here, is there no collision? We're done. Or have you completed the transmission? Oh no, then we keep on moving around here. Once we have completed the transmission, we drop down here and we say successful. We transmitted our frame. Great, this is what we want. This is how Ethernet on Wi-Fi works. Or any Ethernet that uses a shared medium. For the receive MAC, it's slightly different. We are the receive process, and receive process, how do we know when someone will send something to us, right? We don't know, so we need to be in receive mode all the time. So, we're listening now, is the channel active? Is there some transmission going on? Yes? Then we start receiving. Is the channel still active? Yes. Keep on listening. If the channel is not active, we check what did we receive. Is the received frame too small, i.e. there has been a collision or something, or we perhaps started listening during when half of the frame was received or transmitted. Okay, if it's too small, yeah, either go up here, channel like it. If it was not too small, do we recognize the address in this frame? And now we have to look, what is the destination address here? Is this something that would make sense? Is this our address that we have been assigned? I think that we have done this a little bit differently. But if it is recognized address by that I'm supposed to be listening to, I move on to the next step as check, is the frame check sequence of this frame correct? If it is correct, then I have successfully received the frame. And then I report, I send the frame, hey, I got this, and I deliver that to the upper layers. If the frame check was not correct, are there any extra bits? Then this generates a receive alignment error. So I was expecting it to be like this, but it was like that. Nothing I can do about, but that's a specific type of error. So I note that, report method, frame is discarded. No, if there are no extra bits, we receive it, but we mark it as frame check error, and we should discard it instantaneously. Because if there's a mismatch on the frame sequence, this frame has been corrupted in some way. We cannot really trust what's inside it. And that was my remark. I would do this before if I recognize the address. Because if I recognize the address but the frame check is wrong, no. That they wasted a lot of resources doing that. But that is how the medium access control works in principle. We omitted some details. But the point that I want you to remember is the inter-frame check, inter-frame gap, before you transmit, the collisions handling, and the frame check here. If there's an error on the frame when you receive it, it's going to be discarded. So, Ethernet naming conventions. Okay? There are a bunch of Ethernet names around. The classical one is 10 base 5. That was a thick coaxial cable. You can have runs of up to 550 meters. The next step in development was the 10 base T, which made use of 2 pairs of Cat3 or better UTP cables. Basically, that twisted pair. Then we got 10 base T and 1000 base T on twisted pair cables. That would allow us to do 100 megabits or 1000 megabits. So basically T means twisted pair. You can actually have 2 signal ways of doing this. It's called base or broad, and broad is used in case you're using a broadcast medium, like cable TV or the single coaxial cable that ran through all of the offices. You don't use those anymore, much more. We have SX, CX, It's a fiber connection. It's a fiber medium. SX is multi-mode. You have also something that's called single mode fiber. And then you have ZX, which is I'm not sure how it's defined, but it's a different type of fiber. You cannot interchange these guys. 10G base T. If you're using a Cat6E cable, you can reach 100 meters. And if you use a Cat6 cable, you can reach 55 meters. And then we have 40 base G base T, Cat8. Then we can go 30 meters, which is rather short. But it's 40 gigabits per second. That's fast. And then we have the 1,000 gigabits, 100 gigabits, it's a little bit faster. 100 gigabits, which uses a cable that's called twin-ax. You can also use optical cables, but that can go 7 meters. That's not a far distance. But these guys are mainly used for short distance communications. You can have similar technologies that can go much longer distances that still use the Ethernet protocol, but they are usually tweaked in one way or another. So the upcoming standards, well, I have 40 gigs and 100 gigs. Those have been standardized. So you can buy products using these technologies. They cost, however, a lot of money. In progress is the 400 gigabit Ethernet. I think also there's an 800 gigabit Ethernet going on. Yeah. And then eventually we will get terabit Ethernet. That's a lot of speed. And the reason for the 1 terabit Ethernet is that in data centers, there's a lot of data being shuffling around. And you want to be able to shuffle data around as quickly as possible. I would say, I guess there's a very small market for that at this point. But as you know, everything needs to go faster and better, right? So if you guys happen to give this lecture or something similar in 20 or 30 years, I would not be surprised if we're talking about 100 terabits of Ethernet or something. 100 terabits. So the Ethernet frame looks like this. You have a 14-byte header, which constitutes of a 6-byte destination address in the beginning, followed by a 6-bit byte source address, who's sending this, and then a type field of 2 bytes. Then you have a payload, and this payload is 46 bytes, between 46 bytes and 1500 bytes. And after that, you have a 4-byte CRC checksum. This is the frame check sequence. Now, the reason why we have the destination MAC in the beginning is very simple. If you have a device that receives the frame, as first, it will basically read this frame in this sequence. Once you have that byte, that one, that one, that one, that one, once you have the 6 first byte, you can start preparing or doing your forwarding lookup. Where is this frame supposed to be going when I'm moving this around? So until all of the remaining part of the frame has been received, you can do your lookup, do your preparation. Then you should compare the checksum. If the checksum matches what you calculated, what's sent, the frame is correct. and you can push the frame onto the interface where it's supposed to be going. If it's incorrect, you throw it away. Compared to receive everything, calculate the checksum, oh, it's okay, and then move it over to forwarding, that will take more time. You will never be able to do what's called line break in that sense. But 12 bytes of addresses, first destination followed by source, and a type. That type specifies what is the information found in the payload. The payload has to be a minimum 46 bytes, maximum 1500, according to the standard. Remember what I said about in the first lecture about technology protocol standard? The 46 byte is there for a reason. This is to handle this duplication path. Remember this medium? We want to make sure that we're talking, it's there. So we have a minimum size to ensure that you're not going to have duplications. The upper size here is more depending on how you implement. You can make it a little bit bigger. You can have 1540, you can have 1580 or something. Depends a little bit on the implementation that this particular driver is using. There's no technical limitation on it. But it's a matter of everybody has to agree on something. And the standard saying you need to do 1500 bytes. Now, 1500 bytes. And then it checks. If we go to gigabit Ethernet, you will see that this size changes. It's going to be 9,000 bytes, or up to 9,000 bytes. In the case you want to send a message that is smaller than 46 bytes, Ethernet driver or the Ethernet protocol will pad your message with zeros. Ensure that it actually transmits 46 bytes. So for instance, if you take an IP packet with a UDP frame, the IP header is 20 bytes, the UDP is 8, that's 28, and then you add 1 byte of message, that's 29 bytes. Even if you think you're just sending 29 bytes, on the wire, you'll be sending 46 bytes, plus the other information of the Ethernet, right? Just a second. I'm sorry about that. I'll try to stay in front of the mic instead. All right? Difficult. I like to walk around. So, switching basics. Okay. So, I'm sorry. You need to have good hearing. Try to rearrange that. Sorry. Yes. Is someone watching the screen? No, good. All right. So here we have a very small network. We have an Ethernet device, a switch. Right, let's assume it's a switch. Here we have, on this port, we have 2 devices. This one. Over here we have C2, 1B, 23, 09, 051, and 017. So this switch, or this device, this is its address table. It has it somehow. So, when this device wants to send a message to this device. It builds a frame with 17 as destination, 46 as source, put whatever type and payload it needs, puts it out on the wire. Any noise? No, I can transmit. Comes over here, the switch receives it, goes through the receiving process, and at the end it checks, is the frame check sequence correct? Yes. Okay? And it's an address I know. So it goes through here, okay, it's destined for 70. That means I'm going to put it out on my port 2. Hasn't changed the frame in any way. You just read it, verified the checksum was not broken, and pushes it out on port 2. This guy starts receiving it. This guy starts receiving it. By the way, this guy, when this guy translated that frame, this guy received it. Check. Is it an address that I'm caring about? No. Where we go? Goes up here? No, we did that already. Goes down here. Am I caring about this? No. Comes out here, right here about this. Yes, that's for me. I'm happy. Yes. It does. It does. This is when you have this. You have a shared media with you. Now, so I'm going to take a peek what's coming up in the next slide. Okay, so that is how it works in principle. A couple of words on the address table operations. When the device starts, when the switch or hub starts, it knows nothing. So it needs to learn, well, either we have to type all the addresses in, which will be a pain. Some guys, I showed you my switches today, a couple of them, 48 ports. And behind the switches, you have switches, which have switches, and then you have hosts. That's a lot of MAC numbers to type in. That's not reasonable. So we need to learn these addresses. And the way a switch learns an address is by listening to traffic. So when a frame arrives at the switch, it makes a note of the source address. Because that source address indicates that if I want to reach that source address, that is available on the port where I received it, right? So now I can take that information, put in my address, okay. What was it? 46 is available on port 1. Done. But then I don't know where is everybody else. This destination I'm looking for, I don't know. So what I do then is I revert back to a broadcast device, and I take this frame and I send it out of all of the ports I have, with the exception of the one that I received it on, because I got it on this one. And eventually, hopefully it reaches the destination. I don't know because I don't get an acknowledgement of it, right? It's a connection-oriented protocol. But at some point, B will generate a frame. Then I will get a frame with B as source on a port. Then I take B, put it in my list, B address, port number 3, over there. And this is how I learn things. And as long as I'm keeping receiving frames, I can just take that entry that I have, how old is this? Okay, I received a frame, timestamp it with the current time. Oh, oh, I keep on updating, just saying, all right, updated. This is the time I saw a frame, 14:05. I saw a frame, 14:06. And then, so I keep the table alive. Then I use the table for lookups, for finding, as I described in the previous slide. You get your destination address, you go through the table, what match, what port, okay, here, push it out. At some point in time, I will float through this. When I'm looking through the table, I might find an address that is stale. I have not received any information on this from this address in 20 minutes or 15 minutes. So the device might have been moved or has changed. In that case, if I'm in the lookup phase, I don't care about that. I just move on to the next one I care about. But at some point in time, I need to do housekeeping on my table. Basically, that means I go through the table and look for all the entries that are older than, I think it's 15 minutes or something like that. If I haven't seen any communication from a device, from a MAC number in 15 minutes, I remove it from my list, thus shortening the list, making my lookup faster, right? So basically, we have the learning phase, or learning operations, we have the lookup operations, and we have the aging operations. These are the three major operations that you have to do on the address table of an Ethernet device. Yeah?
What if instead of broadcasting, we can at the beginning itself, we receive all the MAC address from each and every device will be then we can know at which port what exists.
So you mean that the switch should say, hey, I'm your switch, please report back to me. Yeah, that's possible. But how do you handle when a device is moved? So I plug one device, the device is still connected, but it's connected to this switch, and now I unplug it and plug it to the next one.
You can refresh it at a particular time.
So one way that you're improving speeds in data centers, as far as I know, is that they remove this part. And they hard code the addresses into the switches. However, you lose flexibility. But yes, absolutely. Now, Ethernet does not have a lot of rules or requirements, but there are a couple of them. Basically, these are these. Switches should be transparent, or bridges. Switches and bridges are the same thing, just different things. Read the ciphertext. They should be transparent. And with transparent means that you should not perceive that they are present. That they should not be hampering communication. They should not add delay beyond whatever is on the wire, basically. You want the switch to be equivalent of 10 or 15 meters of wire, not more. 200 perhaps or something. It should not be something that is causing issues. You want them to be transparent. And that applies for all networking things, actually. You want them to be as transparent as possible because that makes the upper levels much more happy. Now, the hard invariance here. We may not duplicate frames. Never, ever duplicate a frame. So what does that mean? If we receive a frame, we can send one copy of that frame, but we should not send two copies of that. We shouldn't send it once and then, oh, we send another. No, never, ever. You don't know what is the meaning of that frame, or the payload inside of that, so perhaps you send the same message twice. That can have some bad impact on some upper level activity, depending on what's going on, so don't do it. Never duplicate things. If there's a problem, things are missing, leave that to the upper levels. They need to fix that. Sequential delivery. That's perhaps a little bit more complicated. Sequential delivery is that you receive 3 frames, you need to send those frames in the same sequence from you. You cannot rearrange them. Or you shouldn't rearrange them. Now, that is a little bit debatable because we can implement quality of service. And we can give different priorities to things in the switch. We perhaps want to give some priority to some types of traffic, and we can do that. But in that sequence of traffic, we should not change the order of transmission. Now, the soft invariants are that we should have low error rate. The probability of an error occurring in our frames, thus requiring it to be discarded, should be low. We should have high bandwidth or lots of capacity. We want that. And we want to have low delay. Do not delay things more than you need. The non-duplication and sequential delivery, these are hard invariants. These are actually the only 2 rules that are specified for Ethernet. Okay, let's speed things up here. So, error rates versus Ethernet rates. So normally we express errors as in bit error rate. For example, a bit error rate could be 10 to the power minus 8 or the 10 to the power minus 12. So that's the probability that there's a bit error every 10 to the power of 8 bits, right? Or 12. So the normal Ethernet would be around 10 to the power minus 12. Of course, it depends on the medium. In the wireless, it would be one thing versus the wired or optical. That's a difference. Now, the frame loss rate, LR, is calculated like this. L is the size of the frame. And in this case, I think this is this. Now, in the case that we have a gigabit Ethernet, now, we're talking about it has low bit rate, right? Low bit error rate, right? With a gigabit, we're translating 10 to the power of 9 bits per second. That's 1 billion bits per second. If we have a normal bit error rate of the transmission medium, we will have 0.001 errors per second. That's nothing. In the worst case, we will have 10 errors per second. So, depending on how bad the communication environment is, that has a big difference, right? And as we scale up the speeds, this becomes more noticeable. Right? On the other hand, 1 error per second, when we're doing 1 terabit per second, that's not a lot. But you will lose 1 frame. Or you will lose 10,000 frames, depending on where you find yourself. So when you have increasing the rates, we need to make sure that the bit error rates are really, really small, because it scales really quickly, these errors. So this carry home here is to make sure that you use good cables when you're transmitting. The higher speed you're using, the better cables you need to do. So if you just bought the latest and greatest 100 gigabit Ethernet, make sure you spend enough money to get quality cables, because if you don't, you will not enjoy 100 gigabit Ethernet. Now, here are some speed numbers I want you to not remember, but I want you to have, perhaps remember one of these. So in my case, as we have different frame sizes, 46 versus 1500, we can have a huge difference in transmission rate, right? No, we're almost transmitting at the transmission rate of the media. When we're transmitting, we're transmitting at line rate, either 100 megabits, a gigabit, or 100 gigabits. We're always transmitting at that rate. Then the amount of silence between the frames lowers our average transmission rate. So, for that reason, we have two different max rates. Now, I always keep this in my mind. 1 gigabit Ethernet, it takes us 1 nanosecond to transmit 1 bit. Now, if we send at the smallest frame, 46, our maximum transmission rate will be 760 megabits per second. Hey, you're thinking, what about, it's a gigabit, right? Why are we not reaching a gigabit? Remember the frame gap? So we send one frame, 64 bytes, we need to wait in the frame gap amount of time, which is 96 bit times, 96 nanoseconds before we can transmit to the next one. For that reason, we're not getting to a gigabit. Now, as you see, when we increase the frame to 1500 bytes, we get a bit closer. We get to 980 megabits per second. Not really there, but it's good. Better, right? The reason why we're not really getting to 1,000 is again in the frame gap. We still need to have a bit of silence and overhead to manage this. Now, those are, in my view, not that important. But I kind of keep them as a point of reference. So, for instance, if I see a student say, well, we set up this network, blah, 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 it's a gigabit, and we pushed 1.4 gigabits per second. I say, not possible, right? If they say they did 995, not possible. If they say, well, we did something different than this, let's say 666, okay, move on. The second part to remember are these. Now, if you're sending the small frame, you're doing 1.4 million frames per second. That's a lot of frames. 1.4 million. If you do the big frames, you're doing 81,000. That's still a lot of frames. So, here are the calculations, the formulas for getting that. So, what I kind of do, my memory is segmented. So I remember this 1 gigabit, 1 nanosecond. Then I remember 10 megabits. 10 megabits, I do 1481 frames per second, or I do 810 frames per second. And then, as I just add zeros here, this just adds zeros. It's good to have that as a rule of thumb when you're looking at data. Is this realistic or is this not realistic? Now, please bear in mind that this requires to be on physical. If you're doing virtual Ethernet, that could, not virtual LAN Ethernet, but if you're doing just inside of a virtual device, things might be very different. But this is what we would expect if you're passing through a wire or a physical Ethernet at some point in time. Now, coming back to the question of how stupid is that we have everything on the same wire, yes, that's bad. Because these guys, as you pointed out, who pointed that out? You had a remark about these guys, that they will be colliding. This guy will be hearing this, but he's not really caring. These guys are sharing a collision domain. In a hub is basically a stupid way of cross-connecting a bunch of wires. So the signal that goes here is electrically transmitted on the other. To make things a little bit better, we split this up here, and then we minimize the collision domains of this. So if this guy transmits, he's only competing with this guy. When it goes in here, he's not competing with these guys. But it's still non-effective, right? It's still, if we're more than one, there's a probability we start talking at the same time, right? So it's not good. The good thing with this is that we just pull one wire, right? Now, what we are currently experiencing is that we have switches, and then each device has a cable to the switch port. Between the switch and the post, there is a unique collision domain. And so we only have one sender and one receiver, and we're perhaps using duplex, full duplex. I can talk as much as I want because I know the other guy is listening to me, and he can talk as much as he wants because I'm listening to him. Exactly. So the collision domain is now practically removed on the wire. You can still have collisions in the switch, depending on how the switch is implemented. If we're cheap, or the device manufacturer is cheap, they have done a shared memory approach. You receive the frame, you put it in memory, and then you say, okay, interface 2, here's the, you have a memory for interface 2. And then when you receive a frame, oh, it goes to memory of number 2, you put it in. But number 2 has only a finite amount of space, right? In that memory, it's not infinite. And once we've filled up that buffer, the frames will be blocked. And as we're Ethernet, or we're talking about Ethernet, Ethernet will not inform anybody, hey, I dropped a frame. And furthermore, we will not know if that frame is dropped because of lack of buffer space, or it was a frame check error. So it's important that the upper layers are aware of that, just like they have to be aware that IP is also connectionless and doesn't care. But they will not be competing for capacity on the first hop. Multi-layer switching. multi-layer, okay, so there has been a trend to say that you're doing switching on layer 3, which is the network layer. You're not. You're doing routing. You're moving packets. You move one packet from one network to another. You're doing routing. You're not doing switching. Switching is on layer 2. The term switching came because some guy at, what was it, marketing, thought it sounded cooler than bridging. So it became switching, called switching in the 90s, because that sold more equipment and it sounded faster. Now that information has now propagated to the upper layers, so you can hear about people say, yeah, we're doing the application level switching. What? You ask, what do you mean? You're not switching. But sometimes people grab names because they sound cool and they just want to use it. That doesn't mean that we're moving data back and forth. They are. But it's not the same as switching as we're doing here. So when I see multi-layer switching, I'm a little bit cautious. Just that you need to clarify, what do you mean? That doesn't prevent you from saying, I have an application that runs up here that makes use of information from the lower levels and perhaps even changes the stuff that is on the lower layers so it behaves differently. But I would not be calling that switching. Still not calling that switching. There are 3 types of switches I want you to be aware of. You have the classical, this type that's bounded. It's a box. It lives in this small piece of equipment. Has a bunch of ports. That's it. Once you plug in equipment to all ports, you're done. You cannot really do much more. The next step are the stackable switches. They look similar in the front, but in the back you have some kind of interconnection technology that runs at a higher speed than on the front side, and these guys can then exchange packets from one to the other. From an operational perspective, they become to look as one switch. Here you have 24 ports, and assuming these guys have 24 ports each, you have 24, 48, 96 ports, and you will just see one switch with 96 ports. Then we have the next level of switches that are chassis-based switches. And that means you have a set of base equipment like power supplies, cooling, and what we're not seeing in the background, a cross-connect. And then you slot in modules depending on what features or functionality you want. So in this particular example, which is a Cisco Catalyst 4506, we have a first module up here, which is, I think, a routing module, so we can do some routing. And then you have a bunch of Ethernet ports. Don't see if that's, I guess that's, I'm not sure what it is, but there's a bunch of ports down here, and then there's a different type of port here, 6 ports down here. But you can configure them as you want. So this is fixed. This you can grow a little bit. This is going to be from the beginning. The price is also appropriate. This one you can buy for a couple of thousand, 1,000 crowns, 2,000 crowns. These will be costing a little bit more, and this will cost a shitload. But they have different capabilities. We have one of those. The back plane of that is 196 gigabits as far as I remember. So that can move 196 gigabits per second. If loops. I'm going to break my electrodes here. So, loops are a thing of evil. Now, assume we have the following network. So we have a switch, and to that switch we have 4 computers. That switch connects to another switch, which has another switch attached to it where there are 4 ports. They're similar over here, and those switches are brought together like this. This could have gone here. But for some reasons, it looks like this. Now, we have our collision domains here. So if this guy wants to set a frame over here, he needs to know the MAC address, the station address. He generates it, it comes up here. This guy has learned that that device is available on that port. Comes over here, this device knows that that device is available on that port. Goes here, this device knows that it's available on that port, and this guy, it's here. Just repeating it. Now, that's a fine way of doing it. If it's, of course, we could make it simpler by avoiding one switch and plugging it together, but this is the life we have for some reason. Now, we have a human user. Hey, let's say I see 2 switches. I have that computer. I have 4 computers there. I have 4 computers there. I have 2 cables going out into the wall. But I want to transfer data from that computer to that computer. It would be so much faster just to put a cable between the 2 switches, right? So instead of going here, I just go like that. Great. What happens to the switches? Okay? Let's take an example. This guy is trying to reach this device. So initially, the path would be like this. Okay? So he sends it here. Assuming this hasn't talked, this guy goes down here, here. And then it replies. But now they're asking some messages. Now this guy says, I can do this. Okay, I'll push it over here. Okay, great. Comes down here. That works because the address tables are fine. What happens if we're trying to reach that device, which we don't have an address of? We don't have an entry for it. What does this switch do when it doesn't have an address entry for it? It broadcasts, right? So, hello. No, not hello. The frame is sent on this one as well as this one. Okay? This gets it. Okay, I know where that is. But it's already here. It comes here. I don't know where it is. It comes there. Goes there. This will die out. But when it comes here, I know where that is. Goes here. And now this guy learned that that device is over here, but he also learned that it's over here. Because you got that from that path. And now suddenly we can have a loop. The frames can be going around like this. And believe me, you kill a switch. I had an excellent idea for doing something. So I set up 2 switches, disabled what's called spanning tree, that's helped me fix that, and put port 1 to port 2, port 2 to port 2, and then I was wanting to see my magic happen. I set a frame in, and it said, "Gone." They were so dead that you couldn't do anything. I had to pull out the power cables. It will be going like that. So loops are bad. They are really, really bad. To mitigate that, the spanning tree protocol was invented or created. It's an automatic loop resolution protocol. So it builds a tree protocol of the switches and has something that's called routes and designated bridges. When a port becomes active, the protocol checks, is this port, by adding this port, will that cause a loop? If not, the port is added. It takes a little bit of time doing that because by changing cables, it has to rebuild the tree. The drawback with the spanning tree protocol is that it takes time. I don't have the example at hand, but doing loop resolution is complicated. Because you can easily find a near loop, but then you can just move it one step further. It takes a huge amount of extra time to find that. And the further you make your tree, the more complicated it is to resolve. But the spanning tree protocol is something you should be aware of, because it has been used and it is used, but as it has a performance penalty, especially in data centers, we're trying to avoid it by doing things in a smarter way, i.e. not letting users pull cables. However, it's a balancing act. Flexibility versus the problem that happens when there is a loop, because that is perfect. Oh. So these are the port states of it. So when a port is started, it is normally disabled. When it's becoming active, it goes to the blocking state. Then it goes into a listening state, waiting for messages on it. If you don't receive a BPDU or a timeout has occurred, we should be back in blocking. If the forwarding timer expires, we go to the early state, we learn stuff, and then we go into a forwarding state, and this is where we want it to be as far as we know. And if that times out and we have an issue, then we should go back to the blocking state. So that's the principle of the port states of it. The versions that are around is rapid spanning tree. This was done in the 80s. This is faster compared to MSCP. This is usually what's implemented. Cisco calls it, I think they might be using the same name. And by the way, you should be aware that you have standards and technologies, and sometimes a standard is not having the same name as a technology. For instance, Cisco could call this something different. Juniper could call something different. That is just the implementation of spanning tree or version of spanning tree for that manufacturer. They're supposed to be compatible with each other. Okay, questions? So we're getting on 37 and 41. This is going to be a tough one. So, speed, duplexing, auto, MDX. Some of you guys have already had exercise 1. There I talk about MDX. This is when you're having transmission wires here, receive wires here, transmission wires here, receive wires here. That's not going to work. In that case, you use a crossover cable, then it will use. In auto MDX, the endpoints do I follow a protocol to figure out where is my transmission pins and where are my receive pins. That's done automatically. As I said in this exercise, this is excellent when it works. It's crap when it doesn't. The same thing applies to speed. If you have an auto negotiation on speed, the protocol starts at the highest possible speed. Hey guy, can you do 1,000 megabits? It's not it's sending, can you do 1,000 megabits? It sends 1,000 megabits. If the receiver can receive it and acknowledge it or indicate, yes, I can do it too, I can use 1,000 megabits. The next step is duplex. Can we do full or half duplex? Ideally, we want full duplex because half duplex is bad. But it's also an auto negotiation. Now, if this auto negotiations on the speed and duplex fails, you will end up at 10 megabits half duplex because this is the minimum required implementation. So if we cannot do anything, we will drop down to 10 megabits half duplex. And if you thought you plugged into a gigabit full duplex thing, you're going to notice. Layer 2 flow control. Now, in a simple switch, like this 4 small desktop net here, we have a finite amount of capacity on a port. So this guy, let's say this is the out port. That's 100 meg, that's a gigabit port. So that can do a gigabit out. If we now have 4 ports that all happen to be sending to the same destination that is available on this guy, we will be possibly feeding it with 4 gigabits, but we can only be draining it at 1, right? So we will fill up a buffer, and once the buffer is full, the packets will be dropped. And they will be dropped silently. This one will not do anything or tell anything. So it's good to be cautious about these things. Now, we do this in this scenario, we can have a similar case here. So here we have 2 devices sharing collision domains, ignore that. But in the case that there happen to be more than 2 devices communicating out on an interface, we will possibly have problems if they happen to be at the same time. Now, hopefully they're not communicating at the same time, or they can do a little bit of a, they can put it to a couple of packets in the buffer. As long as they're keeping up shut, we will be able to manage, right? So here we're bringing it all together. Duplex, loops, and flow control. And speed as well. Now, if this happens to become, let's say we have 100 megabits here, and this negotiation fails for some reason, we end up with a 10 megabit here, we will have problems communicating output, right? If this becomes half duplex, or any of these guys become half duplex, these guys are full duplex, we will have issues. I kind of try to do my design in a way that I try to keep these guys as small as possible. 100 megabit is usually fine, 1,000 is okay. But these guys should be a factor higher than whatever your hosts are connected to. Hundred megabits? Yeah. That would be my rule of thumb. We try to do that, but then you have practical consideration. For instance, if you have a 24-port switch And you can set it to 100 megabits and you have a gigabit up, but you still potentially might have 2.4 gigabit coming into you, or 2.3 gigabit coming into you, but 1 gigabit going out. But then you pray and hope that you will have, they are not talking at the same time. Or in the case that you have that scenario, so let's say here you have your hosts. No, take this one. Here's your host, this is your back-end switch, and this is the switch that connects your service. Yes, if all of those are talking to your service, you need to make this pipe big. But if they're just using it for internet access, they can wait. We can prioritize. Good you mention it, because that brings us to virtual LANs. So, just a little, we're going to talk about link aggregation before that. Now, in the case here, we had this 1 gigabit. We could not sustain all 23. Let's say we upgrade to a 48-port switch. Hey, great, we have now 4.8 gigabits potential traffic. If we just keep up, we just move the 24 port out, brought in a 48 port, so we still have 2.3 gigabits in potentially, and we have 1 gigabit up. But we could, when we bought that, instead of having a gigabit up, we could upgrade it to a device with a 10 gigabit up, right? Now, a NIC for 10 gigabit cost around 3,000 crowns a few weeks ago. I think you could, yeah, I think this is what you're expecting to buy if you buy a server grade NIC. You can get a cheaper desktop NIC that is not it's something you can put in your personal computer that you turn on and turn off. It's not business critical. You can get that for 1,000 or 1,500. If you compare that to a gigabit, which is around 100 and 200 crowns, that's a huge difference, right? The speed is not equivalent of the price. Now, if you want a switch, a gigabit switch costs, 10 gigabit costs around 5,000 crowns for 16 ports. Now that's 16 10 gig ports. Whereas for a gigabit, you can get a 24 port for around 3,600 crowns. So, and if you want to go even higher, just the SFP, small form factor pluggable, costs 5,700 crowns per port. And minimum you need 2, plus the switch, 2 switches to plug the SFPs into. So that becomes costly. Now, what we can do is, if we have our 48-port switch, which doesn't have 10 gig ports, but we can aggregate, we can combine a bunch of these 1 gig extra ports into a chunk of 1, 2, 4, or 6, or 5 gigabits. We can parallel connect them. That's called link aggregation. So, we can use that where we need more capacity. It requires us to have available ports on both sides, and then we have to pull additional cables between them. We do that by pulling these additional cables, we can get n times the capacity. So, if you have 1 gig ports, if you do 3 port cables, you get 3 gigabits on this virtual link, or this aggregated link. There's a standard called 803.2, 802.3 AD that specifies this, and there's a protocol that's called the LCAP, Link Aggregation Control Protocol. The thing with link aggregation is that, remember the 2 rules of Ethernet: we may not duplicate frames, and we may not change order. So that means that, in theory, if I have a host that is sending a stream of packets, I cannot take that stream and put it on different links across this aggregated channel. Because if I put on different links on that, the receiving side might get them at different times and corrupt the order. So I cannot do that. So stream from A to B will always go across one pipe, but I have additional 3 available, right? So then I can have 4 streams going at the same time, but I cannot do 1 stream on 4 pipes at the same time. Why? What does that mean? Why is he saying that? I'm saying that because you should understand that if your link capacity is 1 gigabit, even if you aggregate the links between 2 switches, the sender and receiver will never see higher speeds than 1 gigabit because they're just going across 1 link at a time. But it's a handy way of getting additional capacity. And there's nothing that prevents you from doing link aggregation from a host to a switch. Okay, so multicast. Ethernet has multicast. It is native to Ethernet. Remember, half of the addresses are multicast. Make use of it. You're going to see a lot of communication on the upper levels. They have issues doing multicast or broadcast. Ethernet does that natively. It's simple for it. There are 2 protocols associated with that. The GARP protocol and the GMRP protocol. I'm not going to go into detail, but if you're wanting to look into multicast, read those. 8 minutes for... that's good. So, yeah, I can do it. Woohoo! Now, read the Cypher's book about virtual LAN. He's really good at explaining it. So, what we have here is that we have virtual LANs is a way of segmenting the LAN into segments or chunks. So, for instance, we want these 2 computers to be on a LAN. We want those to be a LAN. And you can trying to arrange this with IP subnets to some extent. If you put a device on a LAN, we expect all the devices on that LAN to be able to communicate with each other on layer 2, right? I do not want to hear someone else that is not part of that LAN, right? So by creating virtual LANs, I can say, okay, I want these devices to be communicating, I want those devices to communicate. We do that by adding a piece of information in the Ethernet frame, the VLAN tag. It enables us to see this as a software patch panel. So instead of having to go out to the switches and move the cables from, well, you're not part of that LAN anymore, you're part of that, we can just change the software configuration. Now, this device is supposed to be on VLAN 55 now, not 53. Instead of going to the device, changing it, physically, we can just send a command out. That port, everything that comes on that port is now port 53. VLAN 53, VLAN. So that improves security because I'm not seeing those that are not supposed to be seen. It enables mobility because now I can unplug my device over here and plug it in over here. As long as the device is properly configured, the switch will recognize, this is that device, that belongs to this VLAN, and then there's a connection made up for this guy that I just plugged in, and it becomes part of the same VLAN as it was before, and it can communicate as before. Now, the drawback or the benefit, depending on how you see it, is that if you want to move a packet from that host to that host, it needs to go through a router, a layer 3 device. Even if you're just on the second port adjacent to each other. So, there are two types of tags. They are the implicit ones. Then we say, all right, if you look into that, if you look in that chunk of data, read that information, and based on what information you find there, that means that is of that VLAN. The more normal one is the explicit one, and then we chunk in 2 bytes. We put a tag between the source and the type length. The first looks like this. So we have the type is 8001, hexadecimal. The priority, the CFI, from what that means, but then we have the VLAN identifier, which is 12 bits, and that gives us 4096 VLANs. So within an organizational context, you can have around 4,000 VLANs. Normally what you do is you have two types of devices. You have the edge switch to where you plug in your devices. These are usually using untagged ingress ports, so the device that you're connecting is not aware that it's going to be a part of a virtual LAN. It just plugs in. Then you configure the port according to what the device you plug in. So a classical example is that when the device is plugged in, you identify the MAC number that is used to connect. You say this MAC number, you do a lookup somewhere, this MAC number belongs to VLAN 53. And then you say, hey port, all the packets you get from the ingress, you tag that with 53. So the switch receives a frame from the device, splits the frame, adds port tag 53, and lets the frame go on its merry way. When it comes back, when something comes with port 53, tag 53, destination on that device, it moves the tag away, rebuilds the frame, does the checksum, and pushes it out on the frame. And the device gets up. The device is totally unaware of that the frames that it's sending in beyond the switch will be tagged. The other approach is that the edge switch allows you to send tagged frames. And we need the tagged frames on the trunk port, the port that goes up to the core switch, because those need to be identified with the VLANs they belong to. You can also have a tagged port on the edge, but then your device that you're talking to needs to be aware of that you might be receiving VLAN tagged frames and treat them accordingly. The core switches are mostly, and I would say always, using tagged ports. They expect VLAN tags to be coming in the frames that they get. Because they are the interchangers of frames, right? Now, I use the word trunk. And the trunk means a wire that carries traffic that has VLAN tags. In this case, that would be a trunk, that would be a trunk, that would be a trunk. Of course, that would also be a trunk, because if the frame needs to go from here to there, it comes over here, here, here. But those two would be considered to be core switches, so they're natively tagged. Well, not natively, but they're tagged because they're core switches. But of course, you have to configure this in your switch. The switch doesn't know if it's a core switch or an edge switch when it starts. So the VLAN association rules can be based on the port. As I said before, a packet comes in on a certain interface or a port, and it belongs to a certain VLAN. It could be based on the MAC address. When the packet arrives, it belongs to this MAC. Then if this is the source or the destination, it goes to this VLAN, belongs to that. Or it could be protocol. It's TCP. Okay, we tag all TCP packets with this VLAN. Now, there's a VLAN phenomenon called the one-armed router, router on a stick, or a single-headed router. Again, those guys that have done the first exercise, you've worked with the routers. Those have two interfaces, two physical interfaces, that is. Now, in this scenario here, you have one device with one interface, but all of the VLANs are present here. So in this one, we need to create multiple virtual interfaces with multiple VLANs that are associated with the same physical interface. And then we can use that to do routing. And the routing only needs one physical interface, but it has a bunch of logical interfaces. You're having class here? Ah, so you don't have to leave. I see your teacher is here. Okay. Security layer 2. Be aware of nano in the middle. MAC address flooding. So you can flood, if you keep on sending rubbish to the switches, you can fill the address table and things will not be going on, working well. So check that out. And summer we skip. Any questions? So for detailed information or more information about Ethernet, I can only strongly recommend the Seifert book, and it's good to know the basics of it because most of everything relies on that. All right? So, no questions? Good. So tomorrow I expect those that are part of group 3 to be in the lab. Right? And then otherwise it's open online session on Friday on Canvas, and then there's a lecture on Friday afternoon. Okay, have a nice day.